As U.S. senators tell Donald Trump in no uncertain terms to get congressional approval before using national security as a reason for imposing tariffs on other nations, what are the chances of the China-U.S. trade war moving up to another level? And after the successful rescue of a young football team from a cave in northern Thailand, what lessons can be learned from for the future from this nail-biting episode? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. U.S. senators, including 39 Republicans, voted overwhelmingly on Wednesday, calling on President Trump to get congressional approval before using national security as a reason for imposing tariffs on other nations, as he did recently with a variety of product levies against China, the EU and other economies. In the latest imposition, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative announced a list of another $200 billion worth of Chinese goods on top of the earlier $50 billion. The list is subject to 2 months of finalization and input before implementation in September at the earliest. So, are Republican and Democratic senators coming together to rebuke Trump? Is that going to make a difference in time to prevent the trade spat between the two sides from spiraling out of control? Before we start the discussion, I would like to address a common misconception, however, about U.S.-China trade with my personal take. Let's talk fairly about fair trade. President Trump has repeatedly said trade with China is not fair. While the U.S. places 2.5% tariffs on imported Chinese cars, for example, China was putting 25% on imported American cars before the latest trade spat erupted. Many people echo this argument. You know what? I agree. Trade should be fair. But how do you define fairness? President Trump loves golf. Let's use that game as an analogy. He should understand one of the strengths of the game is that weaker players and strong players can still have a meaningful game by the use of a so-called handicap system. Under this system, the stronger player has points added to his score to level up the difference in strengths in order for the game to be fair. The same is, or should be, true of international trade tariffs. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, its economy was only 1/8 of that of the U.S., and its per capita GDP was the level of the U.S. a whole century earlier. Strong economies led by the U.S. agreed to give China some leeway and time to gradually open up its markets. As a result of painstaking negotiations, China's tariffs on imported cars, be they American, European or Japanese, were set at 25%. It was higher than the 2.5% the U.S. taxed import cars, but much lower than the 180 to 220% China has imposed on imported cars before. The potential of the Chinese auto market was deemed big enough to bring huge returns for foreign car makers, let alone the much greater volume of other commodities and services China would import from abroad. Based on these considerations, developed economies led by the U.S. accepted the 25% tariff level and considered this not only a fair deal, but a great deal. Of course, this is a shifting situation. China's economy is now 60% that of the U.S. It's time indeed for China to lower its tariff levels in general on foreign imports. But that should be done through negotiations, and not just between the U.S. and China, but between all different players in the game. That's exactly what the WTO is there for. To assert that trade is not fair simply because the tariff levels are different is a far-fetched and misleading concept. Fair trade does not equal absolute reciprocity. Let's not talk about so-called fair trade, but rather sit down and talk fairly. This is my point, and whether or not you agree with me, we are also interested in hearing your opinion. Here are our contact details. And now, let's start today's discussion. Joining me today from Berlin, Germany is Professor Erwin Collier from the Economics Department at the Free University of Berlin, and in Beijing, Professor He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let me start with Professor Collier joining us from Berlin. As I mentioned earlier, in a vote of 88 to 11, the U.S. Senate on Wednesday sent a non-binding resolution to the White House about President Trump's power on tariffs. What can you read from the U.S. Senators' overwhelming vote, and what are the chances of that transforming the non-binding resolution to an enforceable legislation in the near future?
Well, as everybody knows, talk is cheap. A non-binding resolution is an expression of what one would like. Binding legislation would require Democrats and Republicans really to work with each other and make a lot of compromises with each other. Now, given the polarization that we have observed in the U.S. Senate, it's not likely, in my opinion, to see substantial movement forward, in fact. Now, another thing to keep in mind, in the Constitution of the United States, this tariff authority has always been in the Congress. Only relatively recently in history has that been moved over towards the executive, but always on a short-term basis. So actually it would be consistent with longer traditions that Congress plays a much more active role in deciding which exceptions should be made to the executive authority. And we clearly see in this case, national security has been waved about far too lightly.
Okay, to Professor He Wenping, coming from China, how do you read the U.S. Senate vote as to especially the division of opinion in the Congress? We know that 39 Republican senators also voted to constrain the president's power on imposing tariffs. And is this going to be a game changer? Professor He.
Oh, He Weiwen.
Yes, please.
Yes, I think this is, of course, this is a non-binding. Nevertheless, it shows the general opinion and the tendency in the Congress, especially in the Senate, showing that the vast majority of the senators disapprove President Trump's behavior in tariffs actions. They say that it's necessary to take the power back to the Congress to decide in which particular situation the president could be empowered to take that action. Of course, some people might understand that might be good to bind the hands of the President Trump in trade war with China. This is a misconception because this is only related to Section 232, nothing to do with Section 301. So we still have to move to wait.
Right, sorry to interrupt. Basically, when you say Section 232 is the U.S.'s tariff on steel and aluminum imports, whereas what President Trump has been doing is to impose additional tariffs on China based on the 301 investigation, which has to do with intellectual property protection. Let's take a listen, however, to what Chinese Ministry of Commerce said earlier today about the impact of the trade spat between these two. Let's take a listen.
The U.S. has started and has continued to escalate the trade war, which has posed severe challenges to the economic cooperation between China and the U.S. Probably the ramifications will be reflected gradually in the second half of this year. We will expound greater efforts to properly handle the situation by promoting diversification of trade and exploring other markets. At the same time, the Chinese government will continue to take more targeted countermeasures based on current market conditions.
Yes, Professor Collier, let me go to you now. China's exports to the United States rose only 3.8% year on year. That is 24 percentage points lower than the growth rate seen a year earlier. That's according to China's Customs Administration only on Monday. So what kind of damages are we already seeing on both sides?
Well, a trade war hurts both sides. This is something that one can, the idea of winning a trade war means losing it less than the other party. The United States is in a very funny position of trying to wage bilateral tariff wars with not just China, but also the European Union. So what we have is this, all the trading partners, other trading partners of China, will not be constrained by what the United States does with its tariffs. So there's a lot of room for maneuver for Chinese producers. The United States is not the only market. Now, they would prefer there would be losses, no doubt. But this is not like the 1930s where it was basically a trade war of each against all. This is a hub and spoke system where the United States, meaning President Donald Trump, sees the world in a series of bilateral relations. Mm-hmm. All the rest of the trading partners can continue diverting trade from the United States to other suppliers, other markets. So I think the damage will be easier to see on the United States side than on any of its partners' side, though this is not the first best situation by any means. There should be no trade war. We should go back to WTO dispute resolution mechanisms.
Mr. He, what does the spokesperson mean about targeted countermeasures, and how bad will the trade frictions affect China's exports to the U.S. in the second half of this year?
I think targeted measures means on the U.S. side, they target specific Chinese sectors to impose tariffs to stop Chinese exports to the United States. On China's side, we will launch countermeasures that will target these particular products and sectors that we think will cause pain to the United States, but not so much pain to China. And also, not only if exports are not enough, we should impose measures on other sectors, including services, investment, and so on and so forth. And China, I think, of course, trade war and the tariffs will certainly affect the Chinese exports. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. But not as described as the $20 billion further tariffs. That would look like that imagine, because we say that first of all, 30% of U.S. machinery imports was from China, and 40% of its electric equipment and appliances were from China, and 46% of its electronics and computers were from China. So it's hard to find substitute suppliers. Even if tariffs are there, they still have to buy from China. Only the importers, consumers, have to pay higher cost, and that China will continue to export. On the other sectors, if this could be substituted, then Chinese government could subsidize Chinese exporters having levied by U.S. tariffs. And also we can find additional markets for our, and also the domestic markets to offset partially the affections.
Right. Professor Collier, many farmers in the United States are already feeling the pinch of this kind of trade spat, and yet President Trump seems not to take any U-turn anytime soon. Actually, he went ahead to identify another $200 billion of imports. What is on his mind? Is really the midterm election that he is, the only thing that he's after, and then we'll see what happens afterwards?
If Donald Trump was seriously looking at the midterm elections in any sort of enlightened way, he would be very conscious about precisely the kind of targeted measures. The soybeans bought from the United States. These are states, each of those states has 2 senators. There's a lot of political pain that will be experienced, and if any of those states flip to the Democrats, it doesn't take that much to find Donald Trump having a majority, certainly in the House, and outside shot also in the Senate. So in this sense, he clearly is not thinking of electoral consequences. Mm-hmm. He thinks he is going to be able to resolve everything quickly through a few dramatic measures, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. He, very briefly, do you think President Trump is doing the wrong bet there?
Of course, he's doing the wrong way.
But do people understand what's going on?
I think people understand pretty well. President Donald Trump persists in his own way. He just believes that he could change the world, he could defeat China. That's a misconception because his mentality still remained in the 1980s.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Professor Erwin Collier from the Economics Department at the Free University of Berlin, and here in Beijing, Professor He Wei-wen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, now that the young Thai football team are out of the cave that had trapped them for 18 days, what lessons can the world take away from this epic rescue? Stay with us. It's likely to become one of the quotes of the year. We are not sure if this is a miracle, a science, or what. All the 13 wild boars are now out of the cave. An 18-day saga that started when a young football team entered a cave in northern Thailand on June the 23rd and then got trapped by rising floodwaters finally ended on Tuesday after the last 4 boys and their coach were extracted by elite foreign divers and the Thai Navy SEALs. The leader of the operation, Chiang Rai's acting governor, told the world, "We did something nobody thought possible." Now, the astonishing story gripped Thailand and the world after the group was discovered trapped alive by 2 British cave divers on July the 2nd, 9 days after disappearing while exploring the cave system. Apparently, they had survived underground by drinking water dripping down the cave walls. Assistant coach Ekapol Chantawan, 25, was said to be the weakest of the group when they were found, as he had repeatedly refused to eat any of the food they had and gave it instead to the boys. Now, all 13 are in hospital in Chiang Rai receiving medical and psychological assistance, but it is said they are recovering well. All of them lost weight and will have to remain in hospital for a week and then recuperate for another week at home. So just what difficulties did the rescue teams face and what lessons have been learned for the future? Joining me from Milan, Italy is Alberto Ubertino, Vice President of the European Cave Rescue Association. Amma Mirza, the coordinator of the U.S. National Cave Rescue Commission, and from Chiang Rai, Tony Chen, CGTN correspondent. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Tony, let me go to you first. What's the most striking aspect of this whole story and the rescue effort expanded into a massive government-led operation amid intense media coverage and public interest? What has led this story to be such a headline topic?
Well, I think it's a common news cliche that news is often a roller coaster, but this story really has been a roller coaster. We've seen ups and downs. We thought that we heard they disappeared. We got to the cave 48 hours after they had last been seen. The days that followed the rescue operation was absolute chaos. The rain started bucketing down. The authorities were in a desperate race against time, and frankly, you know, having covered many disasters myself, tsunamis, earthquakes, after a certain window, it is very unlikely that people are found alive. And I think hope really was diminishing very fast when suddenly this diver popped up in a cavern, as the world has now seen, and found sitting there these 13 faces staring back at him, thin but all alive. That then prompted a huge surge of hope. You know, everyone was enormously relieved, but then the difficulty of the rescue suddenly dawned, and it was, you know, when you looked at these caves, the complexity of the dives, and trying to get 13 young boys out of this incredibly difficult situation who couldn't dive, most of them couldn't even swim. So the fact that they are now behind me at the top of this hospital and the top floor is, yes, I think it is quite astonishing.
Mr. Ubertino, have there been other underground rescues akin to this one? The operation was said to last much longer. What do you think had really worked to get the team out successfully so soon?
But I think it was certainly a very good and big operation, and the coordination and many collaboration for a different country and different competence in a different items. So it was good that there was the English that we know I'm from Cave Rescue Organization in Italy, and we have a European Cave Rescue Association, so we know everybody in between, and the English are very, very good divers. We know most of them, they make since a long time very big and they discover many caves. They have a long experience in a cave, and they have a long experience in a cave rescue in the water. So they can put this experience that maybe it was missed from in Asia, and together with the competence and with the Thai people, that they make a great job in order to take out as much as water as possible. Because as you can imagine, in the cave the water is coming from a mountain, so it's a huge quantity of water going to the caves. So I think it was an example of very good collaboration.
Mirza, let me go to you now. How difficult this has been from the perspective of coordination? There are multiple international teams from China, from UK, Australia, the United States. How different teams have been able to work together, if they did, to ensure the best result?
Well, the first challenge they faced, of course, was the fact that the sheer scale of this operation. We have never had a cave rescue that involved this many people for this long of a time period. The largest ones that we've had in the United States might have involved a few hundred people and lasted a few days. So that right there was an enormous difficulty. And then the fact that there are only a very few cave divers in the world who have the level of skill and qualification and experience needed to perform this rescue meant that they had to bring in divers from all over. Just that international cooperation really made this operation. And there are a lot of governments who would not have been as willing as early on to have that level of international cooperation. So everything came together very well. The Thai government just did an outstanding job of organizing that large scale of an operation, and then the fact that we had experts from around the world who were able to help perform it just made it successful.
Right. Tony, let me go to you again. We know there have been teams of Chinese rescuers, altogether 11 of them. What kind of role have they played, and what kind of efforts have they made to try to, you know, help contribute to the successful operation?
Well, they came very early on in the sort of international response. The first team, and it was really just these two British divers were the first to get on the scene. They had been alerted, and perhaps it was very fortuitous that there was a British cave explorer who lived in Mesai, who immediately recognized what was needed in this and started calling people. I would imagine this is a very small community of people who know how to do this, and he was able to alert them very quickly. We saw those two British divers come in, and then the Americans and the Chinese came in too. They brought with them both skills and expertise, but also much needed equipment. The Thais had been relying on their Navy SEALs, who have contributed enormously to this, but by their own admission, their skill is in the ocean. Now, diving in these caves, again, I'm no expert, I don't know about this, and I'm sure your other guests know far better, but it is a very different experience. They have that skill in China, and they brought it with them. So they were able to support the teams, particularly the two British divers, who then ultimately found the boys 9 days after they disappeared.
Alberto, let me go to you. I know it is very difficult to act wisely when you're in a hostile condition, surrounded by a group of kids. Do you think anything the coach who have led the team into that situation in the first place could have done something differently to avert the entire episode?
Well, I think we don't know exactly how, but anyway, in this period we know that maybe it's better to not go in this cave, because it could happen if the weather is changed. Then everybody of us, when we go around in a mountain or in a cave, we never be perfect, and so I think actually probably the coach was sure that to make a small trip in the cave, and there was nothing really bad. So they were so unlucky that when they went there, there was so big quantity of water, and in the other side they were after they were a little bit lucky, because at the end of the operation the weather it was quite quite good for a few days. So this was helping the operation of rescue very much. And I want also to say that it's very, very unusual that in a cave it happened like such kind of problem of accident. Normally in the cave are beautiful, it's a beautiful nature part of the world that you can discover and you can go in a safety way. And sometimes could happen something, but this is one of the reasons that myself and a lot of people in Europe, in Italy and around the world spend a lot of our time to training ourselves and other people to rescue the people in the case something going wrong.
Okay, so not to avoid the cave, even if there is a certain level of danger. Anwar Mirza, what would you say that people can take away from this entire episode for the ordinary viewers? What lessons can they get from there?
Well, I'd like to echo the sentiment that caving itself is a very enjoyable activity, and if you follow the basic safe caving rules, it's very, very safe. But one of the things that is to be aware of is that some caves, not all, but some caves respond very quickly to rain events and other weather events, and it's important to know what's going to happen before you go into those caves and to know if that cave is one of them. And it's impossible to completely predict the weather. You can have a perfectly clear forecast and still have a rain event come in. So I cannot say as to whether or not they should have known better or not, because I wasn't there, but it can happen to any of us.
Right. Very briefly, Tony, 10 seconds if you can. What's going to happen to that coach who has been quite unfortunate but has done a good job in taking care of the team until rescuers came?
We've been speaking to his aunt. He's an orphan, actually, but his aunt had raised him from a young child. And she said she was there waiting outside with the parents. They have forgiven her. She said from the beginning they felt that he wasn't responsible for this, and they were absolutely sure he was going to look after the kids. And from the stories we hear emerging from the hospital and from those who've experienced this, it does seem to be the case.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to leave it there. Alberto Ubertino, Vice President of the European Cave Rescue Administration, Anwar Mirza, the coordinator of the U.S. National Cave Rescue Commission, and CGTN correspondent Tony Chen. And that's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.